Good morning, everyone. My name is Andrea Barnes, and I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. I have some announcements for you today. Today, after service, there will be a Cedars informational session in the Island School Library. This is a chance to learn more about Unitarian Universalism and Cedars. On Wednesday, February 7th, the Cedars Program Council will be holding their quarterly meeting. And on February 8th at 7 o'clock, this month, Somewhere Over the Rainbow group will be meeting to learn about strategies for challenging negative thoughts. Thank you.
Ooh, I'm not sure what happened there. It's an earthquake. Before I share our opening words, I'd like to invite us all to take a moment and greet each other and welcome ourselves into this space this morning. Hey, two days in a row. It's good to see you too. Hey, it's good to see you, Steve. Yeah, doing well. At some point, I'm going to turn this off because I'm... I was telling Jenny earlier that bell I've had since I was 16 years old. I bought it for myself at a store in Olympia because all those years ago when I rang it, there was something about it that I just lit me up. And so I brought it today to center us. I invite us to take a breath. As we begin our time of worship together with these words by Reverend Anthony P. Johnson. Let us call upon the Spirit that moves among us, below us, above us, and through us. Let us call upon those who have gone before us, who have shown us the way, who have been with us as guides and examples. Let us call upon ourselves as we breathe, calling ourselves to imagine, to hope, to dream, and to do, that the future may build on the past but not be confined by the past, that the future we imagine will bring new things with it. Let us build this future together. Come, let us worship together.
Good morning. I'm Jenny Weaver. I'm your worship associate today, and I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to see so many familiar faces and some that I don't know as well, but I'm glad you're here. As Reverend Zachary and I discussed this week's service, we talked about the term identity. In his sermon later, we'll be talking about this. As we talked, he suggested I use the following prompt. Talk about a time when you became aware of an identity that you had and how this knowledge affected you. And I thought about that. I've had a lot of identities or titles attributed to me, some self-imposed, some non. Some of the ones that come to mind are Alaskan, female, foster kid, musician, writer, farmer, mother. Those are all ones that I identify myself as that, with that title. But instantly, when Zachary said that, I knew what I wanted to talk about this week. And that is my identity as a lawyer's wife, which sounds kind of weird, but just stay with me here. My husband, Tyler, he became an attorney in 1999. And so I've been a lawyer's wife for a long time. I didn't think of myself like that. I thought of myself as Tyler's wife, or my spouse, or I just loved him. My father was an attorney. My grandfather was an attorney. Tyler's father was an attorney. So being a wife of attorney or having an attorney in my world was not anything new, and I didn't give it much thought. We had lots of friends who were attorneys, and they had spouses, and we were all so different that I didn't think about the fact that there was the term lawyer's wife. I want to also mention a scene from the movie Jurassic Park. I know this seems weird. I really like the movie Jurassic Park. And there's a scene in the beginning where John Hammond, who's played by David Attenborough, he's the owner of Jurassic Park. And he flies by helicopter to the Badlands of South Dakota. And he's trying to convince two paleontologists to come to the park to sign off on it. So he flies in and he says, "I don't care much for lawyers, do you?" And they say, "Oh, we don't really know any." And I always thought that was kind of funny, and but when I was in nursing school, so that was my second career, I went to nursing school at Olympic College, and during school and after I graduated, I worked at Kitsap Mental Health Services in the inpatient psych unit. I was surrounded by a really new group of people, coworkers, and most of them did not know lawyers. They didn't have friends who were lawyers. It was a different circle of people. And whenever I happened to mention that my husband was a lawyer, people would open mouth stare at me. And I thought that was really strange the first time, and then it kept happening. "What are you doing here?" was the reaction people would say if they said something. I found this really puzzling. I had this identity as a lawyer's wife for a long time, but this is the first time that I had encountered people who had never met a lawyer or a lawyer's wife. And honestly, it was the first time that an identity became a defining characteristic, which was important to other people, but not to me. And I wondered, why were they so surprised? What ideas did they have about attorneys' wives that did not fit me, or that I didn't seem to fit their impression? Was it how I looked? I'm pretty normal looking. I don't have big hair and I don't carry around a coffee. I don't even know what they were thinking of. I think it was partially because they assumed that lawyers are rich, and why would I be working as a nurse in a county mental hospital if I was as rich as they imagined that I was. And all through nursing school, people wanted to talk about my husband being a lawyer. What was he like? And, oh, I heard your husband's an attorney. I've got this legal thing going on. So it was amazing. One thing I noticed that even if people didn't say it, at least they seemed to feel it, which was, do I have real problems like they do? And I do. Perhaps they had the idea that a lawyer's wife had it made, vacationing in Mazatlan and sipping fancy drinks with a nanny, which that's not me. I think that they looked at me and, I have clothes that are 20 years old. Most of my clothes are very old. This happens to be a new top my mom sent me. I own 3 pairs of shoes. And sometimes before I leave the house, I check to make sure there's no chicken manure on my clothes. So I also realized that this place that I have in the world as a lawyer's wife did come with privilege that others do not have, and I am aware of this privilege. But who I am, my identity, is not defined by this title. So today I dedicate the lighting of the chalice to embracing our true selves, regardless of the titles which we may have and may have been imposed by others. And I would like to invite my husband, Tyler Weaver, to come up and light the chalice. The lawyer.
I've gotten that a lot. Like, I think you're a lawyer?
Can you light a candle? Please recite with me from the order of service. As we come together to worship, we remind ourselves to treat all people kindly because we are one family, to take good care of the earth because it is our home, and to live lives full of love and goodness because that is how we will all become the best that we can be. And now please rise as you are able and willing to sing one of the best hymns ever, in my opinion, which is Lift Every Voice and Sing 149, also known as the Black National Anthem.
I also agree with Jenny and think that is just one of the most powerful and meaningful hymns. Very moving. Jenny mentioned our conversation about identity earlier and how she settled on this story about being a lawyer's wife. It's funny because in our conversations we were talking about, and perhaps Elliot would be better at telling this story than me, we were talking about, similarly, the expectations of a minister's spouse. Not as much here, and Elliot, as we know, has been away a lot, but I remember when I was in Search back in 2019 during the interview process, and one of the churches that I was interviewing with at the time kept asking me in the interview, so every year we have a barbecue, and traditionally the minister's husband has always been the person who ran the barbecue. Is Elliot willing to do that? I kept having to tell him, well, you'll have to ask him if he's willing to do that. But that's not our time for all ages today. We've been exploring a lot about identity lately, and today we're going to start shifting a little bit more to thinking about collections of identities, groups of people. But before we do, I have a little exercise. If you are comfortable, in a moment, I'm going to give a statement. And if that statement describes you, feel free to just raise your hand. If the next statement that I offer doesn't describe you, you can put your hand down. And we're just going to run through a few of these, and I want you to just watch in the room as this happens. How many of you have a name that begins with the letters A through Z? How many of you were born in a year that ends with an even number? How many of you are under 40? Oh, interesting. Let's try this again. How many of you feel that the identity, the gender that you present as, is the gender that accurately describes you, that you are? How many of you are Caucasian? How many of you are Unitarian Universalists? It's okay if you could put your hand down. I won't judge you. Okay, you're all Unitarian. Nancy, don't put your hand down. How many of you are over 70? Oh, you can put your hands down again. How many of you love pizza? Like, love pizza. How many of you are vegetarian? Yeah, I see a few. How many of you are vegan? Both. Yeah. So what did we notice in that exercise? What observations did you have? And just feel free to shout it out and I'll mirror it back to folks. We're old. Okay, that's an observation. I'm not. Oh, I thought we would have more vegetarians.
We assumed that over 70 meant years and not inches tall.
We made maybe an assumption about what the number was describing.
We're all pretty much alike.
We're all pretty much alike. And yet, there was times where I think all were able to raise our hands, and people I watched as we popcorned up and down. And even in a group where we we're all pretty alike here. I believe when we take that time to sort of notice, get to know each other, we find that there is often a very complex intersection of identities at play. Today, when I'm talking about the myth of monoculture, that is what I am talking about. This idea that even within a culture, within a group of people like who are gathered here in this room, that there is a diversity that is present, even if we don't always notice it visually. That there are aspects of ourselves that we bring into these spaces. And when we bring those into the space, it becomes what some would like to call a multicultural space. These are aspects of the self, aspects of our cultural identity that we get to bring together and interact. Sometimes they converge and form a Venn diagram of sorts. Sometimes they diverge, and we find that we have a very different demographic in the room than we initially assumed. So that's our time for all ages today. We'll be exploring this a little bit more fully during the sermon. Thank you. So I want to start our centering moment with the sacred practice of humor. I'm going to offer you a few Unitarian Universalist-related jokes. So we are an interesting tradition, even historically, going back to the 1800s, 1818 to be exact. At the time, in the United States, we had what was called the Standing Order of Churches, which was an idea that if you were Protestant and you weren't Episcopalian, you pretty much belonged to the same church. Denominational identity, like we think of it today, wasn't quite as established back then. But that changed around this time, because what happened was this one congregation in Dedham, Massachusetts, in 1818 started to experience a division. Part of the congregation was expressing a theology that today we would call Unitarian. Well, this was at odds with many of the more traditional folks in the congregation who identified as Congregationalists. We often talk about our Congregationalist siblings in faith, or our UCC siblings, or Unitarians considering Christ, as I like to say. These two groups existed in the same church for a while, but eventually the tension grew to the point that it was clear that they needed to divide. When you start calling each other heretics, it's probably a good idea to start meeting separately. So that's what they did. But the question became, who got to keep the building? Who got to keep the building? Well, as it turned out, even back then, there were a few lawyers' wives in the congregation, and it meant there was a few lawyers, too. And so they went to work and took this to court. Eventually, after 2 years of deliberation, a judge ruled and said that the group who expressed the Unitarian theology got to keep the building. The punchline of this joke, as it goes, was the Dedham decision was the decision in which the Congregationalists kept the theology and the Unitarians kept the furniture. Moving forward a little bit more, we have our Unitarian and Universalist forebearers who were existing alongside each other, both with slightly different views of divinity and the role of Jesus, but who had arrived at a similar conclusion that there was no hell. When asked once to explain this, a minister said, well, the Universalists, you see, believe that God is too good to damn any of us. And the Unitarians, well, they believe that they are too good to be damned. One more. How many Unitarian Universalists does it take to change a light bulb? Committee. Oh, that's a good one. None. The light bulb shouldn't have to change to be accepted by society. I think we oftentimes can look at ourselves and we think that what we have to offer is so good that we are beyond damnation. And I think that is true, and at times we still can fall a little bit short. In that series of jokes, we actually traced a theological thread over the centuries that brought us to today. One of the things that happened when the Unitarians and the Universalists consolidated in 1961 to form the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations was that many of the traditions, the prayer books that had belonged independently to the two separate denominations were lost. A few lost in that they were no longer in use. I have copies of them. They're not lost in that way. But these traditions were set aside. We moved to more of a universal understanding of religion. Former president of the UUA, Bill Sinkford, said that there was a loss in this and encouraged Unitarian Universalists today to reclaim the language of the sacred, to reclaim, as he put it, reverent language. Part of this, I believe, is expressed in what used to be in those prayer books, prayers of contrition, prayers in which we ourselves acknowledge that at times we do fall short. God may be too good to damn us, and we may be too good to be damned, but we can still fall short. And so in that spirit, I'd like to offer this litany of contrition written by probably one of my favorite people in the whole world, Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt, the president of Star King School for the Ministry. Please join me in a spirit of prayer. In this moment of worship, we call to mind those times of failure and regret common to us all. We remember first in silence those times when we failed to do all that we meant to do, or through our actions failed to be all we were meant to be. We now recall our moments of our highest self, our moments of integrity, those times when we have been faced with challenges and chose to live into our deepest values and acted as human beings, always dreaming, always seeking. We recall this part of ourselves too. We choose at this moment to lay down the burdens of our shortcomings and grasp the courage to begin anew. Together, we affirm our capacity for goodness and grace, for freedom and purpose and joy. We are not trapped in our past, but freed by creation to live and grow today. With gratitude, we say, Amen, and blessed be.
At this time in our service, we share our joys and sorrows with each other, sharing joys that we may celebrate with you, and if you have a sorrow, to help you bear it. This section of the broadcast will not be live, and it will not be recorded. If you have a joy, come up and in a brief couple of sentences tell us what your joy is. Pour some water that we may buoy that joy with you. If you have a sorrow, place a stone in which that stone may be that which weighs upon your heart. final stone for all of the sorrows that remain unspoken. And I will also pour a little more water for all the joy that remains in our heart. And now we're going to sing another wonderful hymn, which is We Would Be One, which is 318. So rise as you're able and join us. At this point in our service, we offer our gifts to the congregation. When we give gifts, we are giving of ourselves, our resources, and they are always appreciated by Cedars. We are self-supporting through our own contributions, and each dollar that you can give helps keep the lights on, keeps our programs going, pays for our minister, and other special services and employees. Would the ushers please pass the baskets? Thank you for your generous and blessed gifts.
I don't know if I consider it a blessing or a curse at this point in human existence, but several times in my life, I have witnessed an iceberg calve off from a glacier. I ponder this dichotomy between blessing and curse because I realize that a generation from now, such a sight will not be possible. Raising the question, am I blessed to have seen this sight, or cursed to know that this is a fading reality? Whatever the case be, it was while I was working on a fishing boat in Alaska that I got to experience these icebergs calving off. What I remember sort of most viscerally in my mind about that experience was the sound of that ancient ice as it began to fracture along the point of cleavage in the ice. That geological fault that had been there since the ice first formed, but was only exposed with warming temperatures. The sound was like thunder, striking my ear as my eyes watched this chunk slowly pull away, fragment, break from the larger whole, and fall into the water below. It would bob under the water in a traumatic tumult, spinning, and a wave would go out, rocking the boat. Violently, this ice would bob and below and then back above the meniscus, somersaulting through the cold water until finally it found its equilibrium. As the ice twisted and turned, I kind of remember thinking it looked a bit like a Rubik's Cube, sort of the way that you shift all the sides until that densest point finally settled. It was the first time in my life that I actually witnessed that sort of cliche metaphor we all talk about the tip of the iceberg and all of the mass that is below, how the true mass is below the surface. Lately, many of our recent services have been encouraging us to look beneath the surface of ourselves. We've paused to examine ourselves, to name unnamed shadows that might be lurking in our depths, or to consider the parts of our own internal family and how these various parts come together in an expression of who we are. This work of examining the self is hugely important and very powerful. And it's never work that we've fully finished or have completed. It's always in process. And yet, to focus solely on the self as an individual would seem like a disservice to the reality of life. We don't exist in isolation. Our identities, who we are, that sense of selfness, as I heard a professor once call it, that selfness, not selfishness or but selfness. That sense of selfness is the result of a complex constellation of situations, relationships, and circumstances. This is something that Beverly Daniel Tatum names when she writes this about identity formation. She says, "The concept of identity is a complex one, shaped by individual characteristics, family dynamics, historical factors, and social and political contexts. Who am I? The answer depends in a large part on who the world around me says I am. Who do my parents say I am? Who do my peers say I am? What message is reflected back to me in the faces and voices of my teachers, my neighbors, store clerks? What do I learn from the media about myself? How am I represented in cultural images around me? Or am I missing from the picture altogether? End quote. Sometimes the aspects of our identity are outward and easy to determine, but not always. We explored some of those internal identities in a very simple way earlier during our time for all ages, asking us to identify by raising our hands various aspects of ourselves and considering where they intersect or diverge. There's so much more below the surface of any individual. We can't just know from looking. To give you an example of this, here are 3 specific identity groups that I identify with. I am white, I am male, and I am gay. For me, 2 of these aspects of who I am just outwardly are actually pretty apparent. I think most people see me and are like, that's a white dude. We see that. But that third aspect of my identity, which is very important to who I am in relationship to the people in my life, is not always as apparent. I think back to the times when I was in college at Western. I was out at this point in my life, but was still sort of hesitant when I first came into a new group to out myself. I wasn't sure where always was safe. I had moved to Bellingham and started at Western and was looking to build sort of a new social network, and so I decided what I would do is join the men's rowing team. It seemed like a great way to interact with people, get to know other people in my age group, have a group of guys I could hang out with. Well, I didn't stay with the team for long. It was just a few practices in when it suddenly became clear to me that someone holding that identity of a gay man was not welcome in this space. It wasn't ever made explicit in the way that people were like, get out of here. But the words that people used. The words that people used, not knowing that they were talking about me. Decided it wasn't worth the trouble and silently left the group. I'd like to think that today I might react a little differently. I know when things have come up in my life in more contemporary times, I'm often quick to interject. I feel safe putting myself out there. Not everyone does. All of us, I believe, at times have these aspects of ourselves that we either can choose or not choose to reveal. Sometimes they are essential to who we are, sometimes not as much. Earlier, when we explored that idea of identity in our time for all ages, we looked at how these various identities, as I said, converged and diverged from each other. This way of thinking about identities in relationship, those overlapping spaces, is oftentimes referred to as intersectionality. Sort of like as 2 roads come together, you have an intersection. As 2 different identity groups come together, you have an intersection. All of us hold intersectional identities. We might find that we identify as Unitarian Universalists. We might love to read, but find that we diverge in age. We saw that earlier. Each aspect of the self is complicated and carries with it a complex set of characteristics, family dynamics, and historical and social contexts, as Beverly Daniel Tatum named. But when I think of this intersectionality in terms of Unitarian Universalism, I've often found that I have found that I think we are a religion of intersectionality. We struggle to sometimes positively say what it is that we are as Unitarian Universalists. We're people of deep values who believe in relationships, but I believe that for as many people who are in this room, there are probably as many different opinions of what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist, if not a few more, just for good measure. But I don't think it's just unique to us. I really do believe that if we were to go further and to go to another faith community, maybe one of the other churches down the road, a Methodist or a Presbyterian church, a church where from the outset we might believe that everyone in that congregation believes the same, we would find a very similar divergence in that group. Who we are, what we believe, what we know, how we describe the world and our reality are a result of the experiences we have. It's hard to describe something as being like something else or not like something else if you've never experienced the first thing in the first place. I think we do this a lot, though, where we think of a group of people and we project this sort of assumption onto them. And I don't think it's always bad. There are times that it serves us well, and to be honest, my brain can only compute so many things. I kind of have to put some blanket statements on just to get by. But I'm sure we've encountered times where these assumptions weren't helpful. I think about the number of times, thankfully not in this space, but as a millennial, I've heard someone publicly say something that millennials are just entitled babies. Millennials are just entitled babies. They're not working hard enough. That's why they can't afford life. Or maybe you've heard the same said about the generation cohort you belong to. I know I've heard my share of comments like, "Okay, boomer." It can be funny and playful, but it can also hurt. And the truth is that there are incredibly hardworking and lazy, entitled people in every generation. It's not specific to a cohort based on age. There are times these assumptions don't accurately describe what we're experiencing. As a faith of intersectionality, I think that one of the gifts, the spiritual tools that we are offered and that we can in turn offer others is this ability to pause and examine those intersections. To realize that even within a group like this, a congregation that gathers every week, there is an immense and powerful amount of diversity. And that these sweeping assumptions, these statements we make, at best might erase someone, but at worst might cause actual harm. To exclude people from a group because they're not like us. Or to only invite someone into a group because they are like us. There is no one culture. Just as there is no one person or one identity. We are a constellation, a connection, an interconnected web of all of these various aspects of self, both as individual and as collective self. May we learn to see the power in these connections, the power and creativity in our intersectionality, and see the diversity that is present here as a gift worth cultivating, letting to grow deeper roots. May we know that there are as many views in this room as there are people, if not more, to the glory of life. I'd invite you to rise as you are willing and able as we prepare to sing our closing hymn of the service. It's All Creatures of the Earth and Sky, which is hymn number 203.
Please repeat after me as I extinguish our flame of our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth. The warmth of community or the fire of compassion. Oh, I said sorry. Compassion also. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Technically, commitment and compassion could be the same. Like they invite you to take your hand and just place it on your heart. Just take a breath. Blessed be the light within. Blessed be the light among among us. Blessed be the light that shines around us. Blessed be the light in all. Our service has ended today, but our service to the world and one another begins anew. May we go forth with the courage to be a force of love in a world in need of it. May it be so.